I tried so hard not to fall for you." Those were the last words I expected to hear from the best man on my best friend's wedding day. I avoided looking at him from the moment I walked into the old white chapel tucked between rolling hills outside Asheville. Every wedding had its own rhythm, its own unspoken choreography, and I was determined to stay invisible inside this one. My name was Claire Bennett, just another bridesmaid in a dusty blue dress, carrying flowers, fixing loose ribbons, smiling when the photographer pointed the camera my way. I had promised myself this wedding would be simple. Smile. Celebrate my best friend. Leave before the dancing ended. Nothing more. Especially not him. Ethan Brooks stood near the altar, straightening his charcoal suit jacket as guests slowly filled the wooden pews. Successful. Calm. The kind of man whose confidence never needed to announce itself. Everyone seemed to know him. Investors, lawyers, college friends, family members greeted him with handshakes and laughter, but every time I accidentally lifted my eyes, I caught him already looking at me. Not once, not twice, again and again. At first, I convinced myself it was coincidence. Weddings were crowded. People naturally looked around the room, but the feeling refused to disappear. During the rehearsal dinner the night before, I had noticed it while pouring iced tea for the bride's grandmother. During the morning preparations, I felt it again when I helped pin the veil into Olivia's hair. Even now, as sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting soft colors across polished wood floors, his attention found me no matter where I stood. So I stopped looking. Every time laughter filled the room, I focused on someone else. Every time footsteps echoed behind me, I reminded myself not to turn around. It became almost ridiculous how carefully I avoided meeting his eyes, as if eye contact itself might unlock something I had spent years keeping buried. Then the ceremony began. Music floated gently through the chapel. The groom took his place. Olivia appeared at the entrance, radiant beneath the afternoon light, and every guest stood together. I watched my best friend take slow, steady steps toward the future she had dreamed about since college. It should have been impossible to think about anything else. Yet somehow, without meaning to, I glanced toward the altar. Ethan was already looking at me. Not at the bride. Not at the crowd. Me. His expression wasn't flirtation. It wasn't curiosity either. It looked almost like recognition, as though he had spent years searching for a face he never expected to see again. My pulse stumbled. No, that couldn't be right. We'd never met. At least, not the way he seemed to believe. I lowered my eyes immediately, forcing myself to concentrate on the bouquet resting between my hands. The roses smelled faintly sweet. My fingers tightened around the stems. Stay focused, Claire. This day wasn't about you. It wasn't about unanswered questions or impossible feelings. It certainly wasn't about the man standing only 30 feet away. But deep inside, a quiet voice whispered something I had spent far too long refusing to admit. Maybe the real danger wasn't that Ethan Brooks couldn't stop looking at me. Maybe the real danger was that I had spent years trying not to fall for someone I believed I was never supposed to love. The vows began with quiet sincerity, carried by the warm voice of the officiant as sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows and settled softly across the chapel floor. Everyone's attention remained fixed on Olivia and Daniel, but I welcomed the chance to disappear into the background. That had always been easier for me. Blend in, help wherever I was needed, leave without anyone remembering my name. While the guests smiled through happy tears, I noticed Olivia's bouquet ribbon had started to loosen. Before anyone else realized it, I stepped forward, tied it neatly beneath the flowers, and quietly returned to my place without interrupting the ceremony. Olivia caught my eye for only a second and smiled with silent gratitude. That was enough. It was always enough. My grandmother used to tell me that the people who quietly held everything together rarely appeared in the photographs everyone framed on their walls. At the time, I thought she was being poetic. As I grew older, I realized she had simply been telling me the truth. The ceremony ended with applause that echoed through the wooden beams overhead. Guests poured outside into the bright North Carolina afternoon, where white folding chairs overlooked a wide meadow stretching toward distant blue mountains. Children chased bubbles across the lawn while a string quartet played gentle melodies beneath an old oak tree wrapped with tiny white lights. I helped Olivia gather the train of her dress before anyone asked. Then I adjusted the seating cards after a sudden breeze scattered several of them across the welcome table. One elderly guest struggled with the uneven stone pathway, so I offered my arm without saying much. It felt natural. Invisible work often did. As I straightened another centerpiece, I sensed someone nearby. I did not need to look up to know who it was. "You notice everything," Ethan said quietly beside me. His voice was calm, almost thoughtful. I kept my attention on the white roses. Someone has to. Most people would have walked past all of that. I smiled politely without meeting his eyes. Most people came here to celebrate. I just like helping. There was a brief silence. Not uncomfortable. Just unusually still. Around us, conversations blended with soft laughter, the clinking of champagne glasses, and distant music. Yet somehow his silence seemed louder than everything else. "Have we met before?" he finally asked. My fingers paused for the smallest fraction of a second before continuing to straighten the arrangement. "I do not think so." "That is strange." I forced a light laugh. "Why?" "Because every time I look at you, I feel like I am remembering something instead of seeing someone new." The words landed gently, but they unsettled me far more than they should have. I had rehearsed countless possibilities for this day. Awkward introductions, polite conversations, complete indifference. I had never imagined recognition. Before I could answer, Daniel's younger cousin called Ethan across the lawn for photographs. He hesitated as though he wanted to say something else, then excused himself with an apologetic smile. I watched him walk away for only a moment before reminding myself to breathe. This was supposed to be one afternoon, one wedding, one goodbye, nothing more. Yet as I slipped Olivia's emergency sewing kit back into my handbag, my phone vibrated with a single text message from an unknown number. It contained only one sentence. "Do not let Ethan Brooks remember what happened 6 years ago." The message remained on my screen for several long seconds before I quietly locked my phone and slipped it back into my handbag. My heartbeat had become strangely uneven, not because of the words themselves, but because I had spent 6 years believing that chapter of my life had finally stayed where it belonged. Buried, forgotten, safe. The reception had already begun by the time I reached the garden behind the estate. Round tables covered with ivory linen overlooked a quiet lake, where the late afternoon sun shimmered across the water like scattered pieces of glass. Servers carried trays of sparkling cider and appetizers while children laughed beneath strings of hanging lights that would glow after sunset. Everything looked effortless, beautiful, perfect. Weddings often did. They rarely revealed how many invisible hands had worked behind the scenes to create that illusion. I found Olivia near the sweetheart table, gently adjusting the lace around her shoulders before she even noticed it had shifted. She squeezed my hand. "I do not know what I would do without you." I smiled. "Today is about you. Just be happy." She tilted her head with the familiar look she had worn since college whenever she knew I was hiding something. "You have been distracted all afternoon. Just tired." "Claire." I laughed softly. "You should be dancing with your husband instead of interviewing your bridesmaid." She finally laughed with me and allowed herself to be pulled toward the dance floor as the band began playing an old love song. Watching her disappear into the crowd should have eased my mind. Instead, my eyes drifted across the reception until they found Ethan again. He was speaking with several guests, smiling politely, yet every few moments his attention wandered. Each time, somehow, it returned to me. Not openly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel it. I turned away before our eyes could meet and walked toward the refreshment table, hoping the movement would quiet the growing storm inside me. An older woman stood alone near the lemonade station, studying the handwritten seating chart with a puzzled expression. "Are you looking for someone?" I asked. She smiled warmly. "My eyesight is not what it used to be." I gently pointed her toward table 7 and carried her plate while she thanked me more than once. "Young lady," she said before sitting down, "your parents must be very proud of the woman you became." The simple sentence caught me off guard. I thanked her quietly, knowing she could never understand how complicated those words truly were. As I stepped back, I heard applause rising from the center of the lawn. Ethan had begun his best man speech. His voice carried easily across the garden, calm and sincere, drawing smiles from every guest. He spoke about friendship, loyalty, and the unexpected ways life introduced people who quietly changed everything. Then he paused, only for a second, His eyes lifted from the note cards in his hands and searched the crowd until they found me again. Sometimes, he said slowly, the most important person at a celebration is the one almost nobody notices. Several guests nodded, assuming he meant the wedding planners or the families. But something inside me tightened. It felt as though those words had been meant for only one person. Me. Before I could look away, an elderly gentleman sitting beside the dance floor leaned toward Ethan after the applause faded and spoke just loudly enough for me to hear as I passed nearby. "You keep watching that young woman. Do you know her?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Not yet, but somehow, I think she once saved a part of my life that I cannot remember." The words refused to leave my mind. Somehow, I think she once saved a part of my life that I cannot remember. I walked away before anyone noticed the color drain from my face. The music continued. Glasses clinked. Laughter floated through the evening air as the golden light slowly softened into sunset. To everyone else, the reception unfolded exactly as weddings were supposed to. To me, every passing minute felt borrowed. I stepped onto the wooden dock overlooking the quiet lake behind the estate. The water reflected streaks of orange and pale blue across its calm surface, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh pine from the surrounding hills. It was the first peaceful moment I had found all day. I closed my eyes, hoping the silence would steady my thoughts. Instead, footsteps approached across the weathered boards. Slow, unhurried. I knew who it was before he spoke. "I had a feeling I would find you here." Ethan stopped several feet away, careful not to invade the comfortable distance between strangers. I kept my eyes on the lake. "You should be with the wedding party. They can survive 5 minutes without me." His answer carried a quiet smile. "Besides, I have been trying to ask you something all afternoon." I finally turned toward him. The fading sunlight softened the sharp lines of his face, making him appear less like the polished executive everyone admired and more like an ordinary man searching for an answer he could not explain. "What is it?" He hesitated, almost embarrassed by his own question. "Do you believe people can remember someone without remembering when they met?" I forced a small laugh. "That sounds like something from a movie." "Maybe." His eyes never left mine. "But it is exactly how I feel." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Somewhere behind us, applause erupted as the newlyweds began their first dance. The music drifted across the water, gentle enough to fill the silence without disturbing it. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. This might sound strange. He unfolded an old piece of cream-colored paper, its edges softened with age. "I have carried this for years." He handed it to me carefully. My hands nearly stopped moving the moment I saw the familiar handwriting. There were only 8 words written across the page. "Keep choosing kindness. Someone will need it one day." I had written those words 6 years ago, on a rainy afternoon that neither of us was supposed to remember. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Where did you get this?" I asked quietly. Ethan looked toward the distant mountains before answering. "I honestly do not know. It was already inside a notebook after a difficult week in my life. I remember finding it. I remember reading it over and over again. I just cannot remember who gave it to me." My fingers tightened around the paper. Every instinct told me to hand it back immediately. Instead, I traced the faded ink with my thumb before returning it without another word. Ethan studied my expression carefully. "You recognize it?" It was not a question. I looked away toward the water as the evening breeze lifted a loose strand of my hair. "Some memories are kinder when they stay where they belong." His voice became almost a whisper. "Then why does it feel like mine is trying so hard to come back?" Before I could answer, my phone vibrated once more inside my handbag. Another unknown message appeared across the screen. This time there were only 6 words. "He remembers more than you expected. Leave tonight." I stared at the message until the screen dimmed in my hand. "He remembers more than you expected. Leave tonight." The words should have frightened me. Instead, they left me with something even heavier. Questions. Who had been watching us? Who still knew about a rainy afternoon 6 years earlier? And why did they seem so determined to keep the truth hidden? I slipped my phone back into my handbag before Ethan noticed the tension settling across my face. He was still watching me with quiet patience, as though he had already decided that silence often revealed more than questions ever could. "Is everything all right?" he asked gently. I nodded almost automatically. "Just a message from work." It was a simple answer. It was also a lie. Ethan did not challenge it. He only smiled with the same calm expression that had followed me throughout the day. You seem like someone who carries more than she lets people see. I looked toward the lake, where the first stars had begun appearing above the water. Everyone carries something. Maybe. He paused before continuing. But not everyone learns how to carry it with grace. His words caught me off guard because they sounded so familiar. My grandmother had said almost the same thing countless times when I was growing up. Grace is not pretending life is easy. Grace is choosing kindness even when nobody knows what you have survived. I had never repeated those words to anyone. Yet somehow hearing something so close to them from Ethan made my heart tighten in ways I could not explain. A burst of laughter drifted from the reception lawn as guests gathered for family photographs beneath strings of glowing lights. Olivia waved toward us from across the garden, motioning for the bridal party to join the next picture. Ethan offered his hand to help me step off the dock. For one brief second I hesitated before accepting. His grip was steady but gentle, lasting only as long as necessary before he quietly let go. There was no attempt to hold on. No unnecessary closeness. Just simple respect. Somehow that made the moment even harder to forget. We walked back together in comfortable silence until we reached the edge of the lawn. Conversations surrounded us again. Cameras flashed. Music floated through the warm evening air. It almost felt normal. Then an older gentleman approached Ethan with an enthusiastic smile. "There you are," he said. "I have been looking everywhere for you." Ethan introduced us politely. "Claire, this is Harold Whitmore. He was one of my father's closest friends." Harold shook my hand warmly before stopping in the middle of the gesture. His smile faded into unmistakable surprise. "Wait," he whispered. "Claire Bennett." My heartbeat skipped. I forced myself to remain composed. "Yes." Harold stared at me for several seconds as though trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with a memory that refused to fade. I never imagined. He looked toward Ethan, then back at me. "Does he know?" Before I could answer, Ethan frowned with quiet confusion. "Know what?" Harold opened his mouth, but the words never came. His expression shifted from surprise to hesitation, as if he had suddenly remembered a promise he was not supposed to break. He cleared his throat and smiled awkwardly. "Nothing important. I simply confused Claire with someone else." Ethan did not seem convinced, but Harold quickly excused himself and disappeared into the crowd. The moment he was gone, Ethan turned toward me again. That was not confusion. I lowered my eyes, trying to steady the emotions rising inside me. Some stories belong to the people who live them. Ethan held my gaze with quiet certainty. Then I think, somehow, I was one of those people. His words lingered between us long after the music changed. Then I think, somehow, I was one of those people. I wanted to answer him. I wanted to tell him that he was right. That 6 years earlier our lives had crossed for only a few hours before quietly drifting apart again. But promises have a way of growing heavier with time, especially the ones made to protect someone else. Before either of us could speak again, Olivia hurried across the lawn with the bright smile of a newly married woman who wanted every person she loved gathered in one place. "There you both are," she laughed. "The photographer is threatening to leave without one last group picture." Ethan smiled politely and stepped aside to let me walk first. It was another small gesture that should not have mattered. Yet somehow every quiet act of consideration from him felt larger than grand speeches or expensive gifts. We joined the rest of the wedding party beneath the enormous oak tree overlooking the lake. The photographer adjusted everyone into neat rows while guests teased one another about blinking at the wrong moment. I naturally moved toward the back, hoping to disappear into the crowd. Olivia immediately noticed. "Absolutely not," she called with a playful grin. "Claire, you belong up front." Before I could object, she gently pulled me beside her. Ethan happened to be standing on my other side. Cameras flashed. Everyone smiled. At the last second, the photographer lowered his camera and frowned. "You two already look like old friends," he joked while pointing toward Ethan and me. Laughter spread through the group. Ethan answered before I could. "That is exactly what I am trying to figure out." Most people laughed again, assuming he was making another charming comment. Only I understood he meant every word. After the photographs ended, guests slowly wandered toward the dance floor as the band began a slower melody. Lanterns hanging from the trees illuminated the garden with a warm golden glow. Children chased fireflies while older couples swayed together beneath the evening sky. I slipped away toward the quiet veranda outside the reception hall, needing a few minutes where nobody expected conversation. The wooden porch overlooked rows of blooming hydrangeas that gently moved with the summer breeze. It had become almost dark when I heard another familiar voice behind me. I thought I might find you hiding again. This time it was Harold. His expression carried neither curiosity nor judgment, only concern. He stopped beside the porch railing and looked out across the garden before speaking. You kept your promise. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. I had to. Harold nodded slowly. You were only 21, yet you asked me never to tell Ethan who wrote that letter or who convinced his father to give him another chance. The memory returned with painful clarity. Rain against the windows. A frightened young man believing one mistake would define the rest of his life. A conversation that was never supposed to become anyone else's story. It was never about recognition. I whispered. Harold looked at me with quiet admiration. No, it never was. That is exactly why I have respected you all these years. I managed a faint smile, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. Then please keep respecting the promise. Harold sighed. I intended to. Until tonight. I turned toward him, surprised by the sadness in his voice. What changed? He glanced toward the dance floor where Ethan stood alone, absent-mindedly unfolding the same faded note once again beneath the glow of the lanterns. Because I have never seen him search for the truth with his heart instead of his success, and I am beginning to believe the promise was protecting the wrong person all along. Harold's words stayed with me long after he quietly returned to the reception. Protecting the wrong person all along. I leaned against the white porch railing and watched the celebration continue beneath. Hundreds of tiny lights woven through the branches above. The laughter sounded softer now, almost distant, as though I were listening from another lifetime instead of another corner of the garden. 6 years ago, making that promise had felt simple. Ethan had deserved a future free from one painful mistake, and I had been content to disappear before he ever knew my name. Back then, I believed some acts of kindness were meant to remain anonymous forever. Tonight, for the first time, I was no longer certain. My phone vibrated again. Another message from the same unknown number appeared without warning. This one was different. There was no command, only a question. If he learns the truth tonight, are you prepared for what comes next? I stared at the screen before quietly deleting every message I had received that day. Fear had already taken enough years from my life. I refused to let it steal another evening. As I slipped the phone into my handbag, footsteps approached once more. Ethan stopped beside the veranda, but unlike before, he did not speak immediately. He simply stood beside me, looking out across the lake where reflections of lanterns shimmered across the dark water. I almost left, I admitted quietly. He nodded. I know. I turned toward him, surprised. You do? I watched you pick up your bag twice. A faint smile crossed his face. Both times you decided to stay. I laughed softly despite myself. You notice too much. Only when something matters. The honesty in his voice left no room for clever answers. After a long silence, he reached into his jacket again and unfolded the faded note one more time. I spent years believing these words found me by accident, he said. Whenever business became overwhelming or life stopped making sense, I would read them again. He looked down at the familiar handwriting before continuing. I built my company around one sentence written by someone whose face I could never remember. My heart tightened. You built a company because of 8 words. Not because of the words alone. He smiled thoughtfully. Because someone believed I could become a better man before I believed it myself. His eyes met mine with quiet certainty. That kind of faith changes people. I lowered my gaze, unable to hold his eyes any longer. Sometimes people simply say what they hope another person needs to hear. No. He shook his head gently. Sometimes they recognize goodness before anyone else can see it. The band began another slow melody as guests gathered for the final dances of the evening. Olivia caught my eye from across the lawn and gave me an encouraging smile that seemed to say she already knew something neither of us had spoken aloud. Ethan offered his arm, not as an expectation but as a simple invitation. Would you walk with me? He asked. We wandered slowly along the stone path circling the lake, saying very little. The silence between us no longer felt uncertain. It felt familiar. Peaceful. As we reached the far end of the garden, Ethan suddenly stopped beside an old wooden bench overlooking the water. He looked toward the stars before speaking so quietly I almost missed the words. I finally remembered the ring. My breath caught. What? Not everything, he admitted. Only one moment. He smiled with unmistakable recognition. A young woman handed me a cup of coffee, slipped that note inside my notebook, and told me that failure was never the same thing as identity. He turned toward me, his voice filled with quiet wonder instead of accusation. Claire, it was you, was not it? I could have denied it. I could have smiled politely, wished him a wonderful evening, and walked back toward the reception before another memory had the chance to surface. For 6 years, that had been my plan. Quietly disappear. Let him keep the future he had earned without ever knowing who had stood beside him on the hardest afternoon of his life. But standing beneath the stars beside the still water, looking into eyes that no longer searched with curiosity, but with understanding, I realized the truth had already found its way to us. I took a slow breath before answering. Yes. The single word barely rose above a whisper, yet it seemed to fill the silence around us. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not with triumph, but with gratitude. When he looked at me again, there was a softness I had not seen before. I thought I had imagined you, he admitted. For years I questioned whether that afternoon had happened the way I remembered it. I smiled faintly. It happened. The memory unfolded between us without needing to be forced. A small neighborhood coffee shop outside Charlotte. Rain tapping gently against the windows. A young man sitting alone with a notebook he had barely touched, convinced that one terrible business decision had ended every dream he had ever carried. I had been working behind the counter during my last semester of college. We had never been introduced. He had simply looked like someone carrying more weight than one person should. So I poured him another cup of coffee before the first one was empty. I wrote 8 words on a small piece of paper because I could not think of anything wiser to say. Then I returned to work. That was all. You stayed for less than 10 minutes, Ethan said quietly, finishing the memory I had never told anyone. Then your manager called you into the kitchen, and when I finally worked up enough courage to thank you, you were already gone. I nodded. Life moved on. He shook his head gently. Mine did because of that moment. I looked away, uncomfortable with the weight of his gratitude. No, you built your life yourself. After someone reminded me, I still had one worth building. His voice carried no exaggeration, only calm certainty. Do you know why I kept that note? I slowly shook my head. Because nobody had ever believed in me without asking for something in return. His words settled into the quiet evening air. I realized then that neither of us had been protecting the same memory. I had remembered giving away a simple act of kindness. He had remembered receiving hope at the exact moment he believed hope had disappeared. Why did you never tell me? He finally asked. I smiled with gentle sadness. Because the gift was never supposed to become a debt. He lowered his eyes, letting that answer rest between us before speaking again. Claire, I need you to know something. I looked at him without fear for the first time all day. I spent this entire wedding trying to understand why I could not stop looking at you. He smiled quietly, almost laughing at himself. Now I finally understand. It was never because you looked familiar. It was because my heart recognized your kindness long before my memory recognized your face. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The celebration behind us continued with music, quiet laughter, and the gentle glow of lanterns reflected across the lake, but it no longer felt like the center of the evening. The world had somehow become smaller, narrowing to one wooden bench, one shared memory, and 2 people whose lives had quietly crossed long before either of them understood why. I smiled, almost shyly. Then perhaps your heart has a better memory than the rest of you. Ethan laughed softly, the sound carrying a sense of relief that seemed to lift years from his shoulders. I think it does. We stood together as a cool breeze drifted across the water. The silence between us no longer needed explanations. It had become the kind of silence built on trust rather than uncertainty. After several moments, Ethan reached into his pocket one final time. I expected him to unfold the old note again, but instead he carefully folded it back into his wallet. I carried those 8 words for 6 years, he said. Tonight, I finally realized I was holding on to only half of the gift. I looked at him with quiet curiosity. What was the other half? His eyes met mine with complete sincerity. The person who wrote them. I felt my breath catch, not because the words were dramatic, but because they were spoken with the kind of honesty that could not be rehearsed. He stepped no closer, giving me all the space in the world to decide what came next. Claire, I spent years believing success would answer every important question in my life. It never did. Tonight I discovered that the answer I was looking for had never been a place, a company, or an achievement. It was a person whose kindness asked for nothing in return. I lowered my eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the quiet weight of his confession. I never expected you to remember me. Neither did I. He smiled gently. But I am grateful that I did. I looked back toward the reception, where Olivia and Daniel were surrounded by family and friends, beginning the first evening of their new life together. It suddenly felt fitting that another beginning had found us in the same place. There is something you should know, I said. That afternoon in the coffee shop, I almost walked past your table. I was running late. I had assignments to finish. I kept telling myself someone else would encourage you if you needed encouragement. Ethan listened without interrupting. So what changed your mind? I smiled at the memory of my grandmother's voice. She always said that if kindness knocks on your heart, answer before fear does. Ethan's expression softened even more. Then I owe your grandmother my thanks too. We both laughed quietly. It felt effortless, as though we had known each other far longer than a single forgotten afternoon and one unforgettable wedding. The band announced the final dance, and guests slowly gathered beneath the lights. Ethan looked toward the celebration before turning back to me. I am not asking because I feel indebted. I am not asking because of the past. I am asking because I would regret walking away without knowing what our future could become. He paused, letting the moment breathe before speaking again. Claire Bennett, would you allow me to take you to dinner next Saturday? No expectations. No grand promises. Just two people finally beginning the conversation they should have started 6 years ago. I could not stop smiling. I think we have already waited long enough. His smile answered mine before either of us took another step. Together we walked back toward the lights, not as strangers held together by unanswered questions, but as two people choosing to discover what life might become when kindness is finally given the chance to return home. Sometimes the smallest act, offered without expectation, quietly becomes the beginning of the greatest story a heart will ever remember.